In this next module, I'm going to introduce you to TypeScript. TypeScript is going to be important because it'll be the language that we use to build our Angular apps. So I want you to have some familiarity with it before we get started. In this short module, we're going to discuss classes in TypeScript. I'll show you how to transpile it in Visual Studio and how to debug it in the browser. Let's get started. Earlier in this course, I introduced you to JavaScript. And TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript to provide features that are in the new standards of ECMAScript. It compiles down to JavaScript, as we'll see, to allow you to use more advanced language constraints like type safety, classes, and other newer features that may not be available in the browser yet. Let's dive in with our first TypeScript class. So we're going to start by just creating TypeScript directly in our www root folder. So I'm going to create a new folder and file. So I'm going to call it TS, and then I'll call it shopper.ts. TS is the extension for TypeScript. And in our new TypeScript, I can just start with a simple class, and I'll call this our shopper. Since you've done C# before, this should feel very familiar. And TypeScript is trying to do a lot of helping you by using a linter to describe errors before they happen. So if you're getting some green underscore errors, don't worry about them quite yet. It's being a little aggressive, like I just created the class and I haven't used it yet. Classes in TypeScript also support the idea of a constructor. In this case, unlike the way that C# does it, constructor is actually just a method called constructor. And we can just create members inside of the class. And so I'll create a first name here, and I'll assign it an empty string. I'll do the same for last name. And we can also come here into the constructor and assign these. So let's say first, last, much like we would do for a JavaScript function, right? And in TypeScript, in order to refer to the members, you're going to need to use the this keyword. This is going to give you access to the members of the class. Unlike C#, this is required. And so let's go ahead and just assign, just like we might do in our own C# classes. And to create a function, you're just going to create a function structure without needing the word function, just like we did here with constructor. If it has curly braces after it, it can assume that it's going to be a function. If it looks like a function, it's going to act like a function. So in our case, I'll go show name. And what will I do here? I'm just going to use alert to say this.firstname, this.lastname. And because this is TypeScript or C#, I need these $signs in here so that it knows it's actually things we're going to interrogate into them. And so we've created our first class. A couple things I want to talk about that are common and really useful in TypeScript is first, type safety. If we hover over this first name, it actually says it's a string. And it says it's a string because it's inferred it from the type I've given it here. But these have been inferred as a type called any, which means it could be anything. And of course, assigning these is going to be more troublesome if they're not strings. So we can use a colon after them to tell it what type it is. And this way, no one will be able to assign a new shopper with anything but strings, and it'll require them both. In fact, we don't even need to declare these. Another pattern that is common is to actually say private, first name, last name, and put private in front of this as well. Though this could be public or other visibilities as well. And what this does is it tells it, because it's a constructor, that these are going to be types that are going to be exposed from the class. The private indicates that these are going to be members of the class. That's why this first name still works, right? Because it knows that we're bringing in a string and then we're using them here in the alert. Let's go ahead and create a second TS, which I will call main.ts. This is just going to be a file that uses our shopper. And so if I say shopper equals new shopper, so this new syntax, which should be comfortable for you in other languages that you're working with, this is actually going to take, and we can see that it's inferred these types. So first name is Sean, and so this is going to have to be a string. And what happens if I put a 4 in there? Of course, it's not going to accept a 4 because it's typing those parameters, which is something that JavaScript can't do. It's important to understand that this type information is only going to be useful at compile time. It is not checked at runtime. This will help you capture lots of the errors that you may have in your JavaScript by moving it to TypeScript without the heaviness of having a type system at runtime, which would significantly add weight to JavaScript. And so if we take this shopper and then say show name and call it, we can have this work. Because we're never reassigning the shopper, it's actually giving us the hint that we can use const here, because nowhere in our code do we actually change that. So we can see how these are going to work together. The definition of the class, and then the main TS that's going to use that class. Let's see how to actually compile these into JavaScript next. Now let's see how to compile TypeScript. Back in Visual Studio, you'll notice that these TS files are just sitting there on their own. We're not using them in any place. What we want to do to enable compilation is actually to create a new file at the root of the project called tsconfig.json. And this will allow you to set up how compilation will happen. And so the first thing we're going to do, you can see we have some IntelliSense here, is we're going to say include. We're only going to include files from certain places in our project. And so what are we going to do? We're going to say www.root ts, and then we're going to say every subdirectory and every file in any of those subdirectories called ts. We're also going to specify a couple compiler options, because there's a lot of ways that TypeScript can be compiled. What we want to do in this case and say module type is actually none. And none means that we're not going to be using a way to compile these all together into one file. We're actually going to let every file compile it on its own. And we're going to also say source map equals true. And the reason to use source maps is to allow us to do debugging, which we'll see in our next section. Of course, we've forgotten the little comma here. And the last option we'll add here is actually compile on save. This will tell us to go ahead and every time we save a file, go ahead and compile it. So if we come back to the shopper, let's go ahead and save that. You'll actually see it's compiled all of the pieces here. We've actually got a shopper.js and a shopper.js map. And what this has done is actually create a class-like object in the JavaScript that will work like a class for us. This is to support class declarations before classes have been allowed in JavaScript. And so this will work with ECMAScript 5 browsers and above. You can actually specify what level of ECMAScript you want to support. I'm going to leave it as is. The other piece is this main is going to do the same thing. It's going to assume that we're going to include this shopper.js before the main.js. That's specifically how it's going to know which of these files I'm going to load up first. This syntax all looks the same as the TypeScript because it is. There isn't anything special here. But you'll see in the shopper.js that it has specified that there's a first name and last name to this object, but there's no type checking in here. Now that we've compiled them, let's take a look at how to debug them. So now let's talk about debugging it in the browser. Back over in Visual Studio, let's go down to our views, and we're going to open up that shop view that we saw earlier. And I'm just going to use that at section scripts to go ahead and add these. We've used a section scripts before to include different kinds of files. I'm going to first bring in that shopper.js and drop it there, because again, it's just a JavaScript file like any other, and I'm going to put the main after it. And the hope is that as it reads these, we should be able to see that alert pop up with my name in it. So let's go ahead and run this. If we go to the shop page, we're going to need to log in first. And there's my name. It's because this JavaScript is just doing what we told the TypeScript to do. But what about debugging it? If we open up the tools with F12 and let's go to the debugger, so this would be very similar in Chrome or other browsers, we can see that the main.js and shopper.js were loaded, but also the main.ts. And it knew this because of the mapping file. We can actually come in here to the main, or actually let's come in here to the shopper and let's set a breakpoint for before this alert happens. Notice I'm debugging the TypeScript file, not the JavaScript file. I could still debug the JavaScript file if I want, but this is really debugging the actual code that you're running. Let's refresh that page. And now we can see we're in the alert, and that we can see that this is that object that has my name as the first name and last name. That's what that class ends up resolving to. And so we can debug this just like any other. We can walk over the code, see it show the alert, and then just continue our operation, right? And so by using the map files, that's the reason we added them, we're going to be able to debug the actual TypeScript we authored instead of having to debug the JavaScript. This JavaScript isn't that complicated, but as you get into more and more code, it is going to get more complicated. And so understanding how to debug the actual TypeScript is going to be important. And we'll see more of that as we build our Angular app with TypeScript. Let's wrap up this brief module. So what we learned. I've shown you how you can use tomorrow's JavaScript features today by using TypeScript. I've talked about that you need a transpiler to produce JavaScript from TypeScript with optional type safety during that compilation or transpilation process. And finally, TypeScript's going to be the best way to build your Angular apps. While TypeScript isn't required, TypeScript or Dart are required. You can't do it with plain old JavaScript. And so TypeScript is the way that most people build their Angular apps. Directly from TypeScript, you're going to head right into Angular and build an Angular app in the next 3 modules.